The idea that the polluter pays, or you broke it, you bought it, which was a phrase that I think Ambassador Solon used during Copenhagen. That's what Colin Powell described as the pottery barn rule. In the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. These are familiar concepts to people in this country, that if you do create an environmental disaster, you do have to pay for the cleanup. That's the idea behind the Superfund, for instance. Now, of course, it doesn't actually happen. The Superfund is not being funded. But these are familiar justice concepts in this country, which is why I'm troubled when I hear from people in the US who say, you can't talk about climate debt, and you certainly can't talk about climate reparations. That will never sell here. Indeed, it does. People do believe in these basic concepts of responsibility, possibly more than they believe in the concept of aid and welfare, and that you should just do it out of the goodness of your heart. I think justice arguments are eminently sellable. Indeed, I think they are more sellable than the alternative. The other reason why it's important is that when we acknowledge that there is this debt, that there is this inequality, that there is this duty and responsibility, it equalizes the negotiating dynamics that are so unequal to begin with. One of the things that is just so striking in these negotiations, you look at a country like the United States or Canada, they have these huge delegations and ample resources feeding them, and then you have the countries that are actually going to be wiped out by climate change, and they have maybe 3 or 4 delegates and almost no resources backing them up. So coming to the table not in the most compromised position you can be in. If you go into a negotiation and you are literally fighting for your life, fighting for your survival, you have no power in that negotiation. What the claim of climate debt and the right to reparations brings to that dynamic is empowerment. If it is backed by movement muscle, and this is where social movements are so important. It's not just an intellectual argument. It will only matter if social movements around the world and in this country, and it is starting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet in this country enough, are backing up that demand with the numbers and with tactics that back it up as well. I think we need to start using some of the tactics that we saw in the anti-apartheid struggle, where governments and corporations face sanctions, divestment campaigns, when they are failing to live up to their obligations. One of the things that we heard a lot about in Copenhagen was that you may be right, but this isn't practical. I mean, you need to get realistic and embrace things like cap and trade and embrace what the U.S. Senate is willing to do. I think it's really important for people to understand that if the policies on the table are actually adopted and enforced, and that's a big if, it would be utterly catastrophic for the environment. And one of the things that happened at the very end of the Copenhagen Summit is that somebody leaked a document, an internal UN document, that was the UN's own calculations of what would happen if every country went home and cut their emissions by the amounts that they were pledging they would cut them. Like the United States, came to the table with, that they would cut maybe by 17% below 2005 levels, which was actually 4%, and so on. Japan was talking about 30. The EU was wavering between 20 and 30. So if everybody went home and did what they said, the UN said this would lead to temperature increases of 3 degrees, not the 2 degrees that they were saying was enough, and which we reject, we don't think is enough. And the whole premise of the 350.org campaign is that we have to get to 350 parts per million, and that is more like 1.5 degree. Bolivia is calling for 1 degree, and we can hear more about that. But the point is that by their own calculations, they would bring on catastrophic climate change. Such 3 degrees, that means 4 to 4.5 in Africa. Okay, so what their plan on the table is an absolute disaster by their own measures. So the urgency for an alternative is, I hate to quote Margaret Thatcher, but I really feel increasingly that there is no alternative. This is really about stopping a robbery in progress. And you know, this is a concept that Pablo can talk much more eloquently about than me, is the concept that it isn't simply that a polluter pays idea where we have emitted and caused a crisis and we need to pay for the cleanup, though that is also true. It is also that we are occupying atmospheric space by continuing to emit far more than our share of the sky. We are refusing to share the sky. And the only real solution to that are dramatic emission cuts, which is really the problem with cap and trade. I mean, we can talk about, you know, whether it would cause a, you know, another bubble, whether, you know, we can talk about Goldman Sachs and whether this government that can't regulate derivatives could be trusted to regulate carbon. I think not. But the real issue is that it's a massive distraction from the sense of urgency that we need to have to start radically cutting emissions. It's a sideshow, and we do not have time for sideshows. One concept that, the concept that I think is most exciting when we think about the possibilities of a movement based on the concept of climate debt is something that Angelica Navarro, one of the climate negotiators for Bolivia, articulated, which is the idea of a Marshall Plan for the Earth, for planet Earth. Because when we talk about reparations, it isn't simply a punishment, because these resources would be the resources that would be spent for the world to leapfrog over fossil fuels and go immediately to clean energies. But these are more expensive energies. They have more upfront costs. They're cheaper in the long run, but they have heavy upfront costs, and it's simply not going to happen without technology transfers that are illegal under WTO rules, which is, you know, why we need to talk about the intersection between all of these mechanisms. It's not going to happen without a transfer of wealth. It's not going to happen without a redistribution of wealth. But it isn't aid, it isn't charity, it is justice.